Hello, I'm Dr. Marisa Weiss, Chief Medical Officer at Breastcancer.org. Thank you all for coming together to learn about an issue that affects every single person's well-being, health literacy, which means your ability to obtain, process, understand, and use health information so you can make smarter health and medical decisions. Today, I'll be talking more about what health literacy is, how it can impact your health, and ways we can improve it. We're also going to talk about how you can use health literacy skills to read about breast cancer research and understand what you're reading. We hope to show you that you don't need a medical or science background to understand how to read cancer research, so you can advocate for the best care possible for yourself and for your loved ones. This webinar is called Take Charge of Your Health, because that is core to our mission at Breastcancer.org. We want to give you the tools, expert guidance, confidence, trusted resources, and support to make informed decisions for your life. If you need answers about breast health and breast cancer, we are here for you. If you're looking for peer support from others who understand what you're going through, that's where our breastcancer.org community comes in. You can join thousands of discussion boards on the website for a secure place to read and share experiences. Today's webinar will include information about health literacy that can be useful to people with breast cancer, their loved ones, and really just about anyone making decisions about their health and medical care. We hope you find it helpful and reassuring no matter what your health situation is that you're dealing with. We're thrilled to be partnering with GRASP on today's program. GRASP stands for Guiding Researchers and Advocates to Scientific Partnerships. It is a nonprofit that connects cancer researchers and advocates so they can learn from each other. Later, you'll hear from Dr. Jenny Shang from Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, who is a GRASP research member. We thank Dr. Shang for being with us here today. I want to give a huge thank you to our sponsor, Lilly Oncology, for making this webinar possible and for their longtime support of breastcancer.org. I'm pleased to share a brief video message from Ann White, Senior Vice President of Eli Lilly and Company and the President of Lilly Oncology.
We are living through extraordinarily challenging times, but as you know, cancer doesn't stop. Not for our exceptional and overtaxed medical professionals, and certainly not for those living with cancer. That's why no matter what's happening in the world, Lilly Oncology won't stop either. The promise of science to change people's lives has never been greater, and Lilly Oncology is as dedicated as ever to developing and delivering medicines that will make a meaningful difference.
So what exactly is health literacy? Health literacy is our ability to collect and understand health information so we can make the best decisions for our health, our well-being, our medical care, and for the care of our loved ones. We've all had to navigate the healthcare system, whether it's finding doctors, scheduling appointments, filling out forms, understanding test results, or following medication instructions, or taking other treatments at home. Having good health literacy can make all of these things easier to manage. Every single one of us can benefit from improving our health literacy. Even me as a doctor. Having good health literacy can help us participate in shared decision-making with our doctors. Understanding your treatment options and communicating with your doctors about your specific goals and concerns is particularly important when making decisions about your breast cancer treatment plan. More immediately right now, you might be making decisions about your care related to COVID and the vaccine. With so much moving quickly on who is eligible to get the vaccine, which vaccine is right for you, and when it is safe to get the vaccine, it's extra important to take the time with your doctor to make these decisions together and for yourself. In addition to managing medical conditions, good health literacy can also help us benefit from early detection and prevent serious disease. As many of us know, things like regular mammograms or an annual flu shot are just some of the important tools to protect our health. But many people don't know that mammograms and vaccines, including the COVID vaccine, can save your life. These basic tools keep us healthy, and they're all part of health literacy. Let's talk about some of the reasons that developing good health literacy can be challenging. Well, as many of you know well, getting diagnosed with breast cancer is an emotional experience, to say the least. And I'm a 10-year survivor, and I can vouch for that myself. Processing medical information when you're feeling upset, worried, and confused is a big challenge. In fact, it's almost impossible to learn when you're upset. For most of us, medical terms will be new and complicated. And when you're hearing a lot of these new terms all at the same time when you're diagnosed with a disease, it is difficult, if not impossible, to absorb everything. Maybe you've been diagnosed with a disease involving part of your body that you've never heard of, or whose function you don't yet fully understand. Weighing the risks and benefits of your treatment options can be confusing when they are explained with complex statistics, percentages, or numbers. Your mental health, feeling fatigued or overwhelmed by a medical condition, can have a major effect on your ability to manage your health. And taking medicines or other treatments at home can involve complicated instructions. You might need help with that. And if you live in the United States, but you're not fluent in English, navigating our healthcare system can be extra hard. Here is a very revealing comment from a member of the Breastcancer.org community that I think perfectly captures the frustration many of us feel when trying to understand and communicate about a health condition, especially if it's private, personal, and maybe a little embarrassing. She said, quote, "I just hate not being able to communicate my concerns effectively. And I've been Googling forever, trying to figure out the words for what I'm experiencing," end quote. So what are some of the simple steps we can take to improve our health literacy? For starters, when you are with your doctor or a nurse or anyone else from your medical team, I encourage you to ask questions. Your healthcare providers should speak to you in plain language and help you understand the information they're trying to share. But that doesn't always happen, even with the best healthcare providers. So don't be embarrassed about asking them to explain things better if you don't understand what they're saying. You deserve to have your questions answered. When you hear information that is new to you, it can help to repeat what your doctor says in your own words. And if your doctor is speaking too quickly, ask him or her to slow down. If you can, bring a trusted friend or relative to appointments with you to be an extra set of ears and take notes. This can be helpful even if they're on the phone during your appointment. Keep a running list of questions or concerns on your phone or in a notebook that you bring with you to appointments. You can even show your doctor the list as you go through the questions together. If you don't speak fluent English, ask for a translator ahead of time, or bring someone with you who can translate. And if you are someone who can be a translator, call your friends or relatives today to let them know you're willing to help. You can also ask for extra materials to read, watch, or listen to when you get home. This can help you take your time to process the information in the way you learn best. Don't trust everything you read on the internet. Now, all the articles on Breastcancer.org are medically vetted by experts, but that isn't true for other websites that may seem legitimate. And that goes for social media too. You want to know the qualifications of an article or an expert before taking their advice. Lastly, ask to work with a patient navigator. A patient navigator is someone who is trained to help you use the healthcare system and coordinate your care. They can help you access health services, assess treatment options, get a referral, find a clinical trial, fill out forms, and help you apply for financial assistance. Plus, you can find more information at breastcancer.org/tips/health-literacy. Now, as I mentioned before, one of the ways you can make the most of good health literacy skills is to read about breast cancer research. Understanding breast cancer research can give you a better grasp of your diagnosis and treatment options, as well as how to manage side effects of treatment. It can help you be your best advocate. This new video from Breastcancer.org explains how to get started.
Being diagnosed with breast cancer can be scary. It's a life-changing event that can make you feel like you're losing control. Once you've learned about your diagnosis, how do you make smart, informed decisions about what comes next? Reading about breast cancer research can help you better understand the disease and reclaim control over your feelings. You'll be able to better communicate with your doctors, be more aware of your treatment options, and make an educated decision about being part of a clinical trial. Starting online is a good place to begin. You can almost always find the abstract, the summary of a research paper, and read it for free. It will help you decide if that paper applies to your situation. You might need to pay for a subscription if you want to read the full paper. Luckily, local libraries usually have subscriptions to a number of journals, so you can read the papers there for free. Don't get overwhelmed. There are thousands of papers on breast cancer research published each year, but certain studies are considered better than others. Randomized controlled trials are the best way to figure out if a new medicine works. Often in a randomized controlled trial, one group of people receives a new medicine while the other gets a placebo, a harmless substance that looks just like the medicine being studied. Both groups usually get the standard of care as well. Next, here are some key terms you may come across while looking at research papers. Disease-free survival means how long a person lives without the cancer coming back. Progression-free survival means how long a person lives without the cancer growing. Overall survival means how long a person lives, whether or not the cancer comes back or grows. Lastly, a term that sounds complicated, but really isn't, is the p-value, or the probability value of a study. This term refers to the statistical significance of study results. The more statistically significant the study results, the more reliable they are. Most researchers suggest looking for results with a p-value less than 0.05. This means there was more than a 95% chance the results were reliable, and due to the difference in treatment. To put it simply, the smaller the p-value, the stronger the evidence. So, when you feel ready, take a deep breath and check out some breast cancer research. It may give you a better understanding of your diagnosis and treatment choices and help you along in your journey. Learn more about understanding breast cancer research at breastcancer.org/understanding-research.
Now I'd like to introduce our fabulous senior editor and podcast host for Breastcancer.org, Jamie DiPolo.
Hi, thanks for that great introduction, Risa, and all those great information you shared. As Dr. Weiss said, I'm Jamie DiPolo, Senior Editor at Breastcancer.org, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next guest, Dr. Jenny Sheng. She's Assistant Professor of Oncology at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and she mainly treats people who've been diagnosed with breast cancer. Dr. Sheng is also a research member of GRASP, our partner organization for today. And if you'd like to learn more about GRASP, you can visit the website at graspcancer.org. Dr. Sheng is going to explain why reading research is important and also how we can all better understand breast cancer research. Dr. Sheng, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about these important topics.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for inviting me back. I love being here, and I'm excited to help people understand how, they have the capacity to obtain and process and understand health information to make better healthcare decisions.
Excellent. So I know each year there are literally thousands of papers on breast cancer published. So to help everybody start to kind of figure out what's important, could you briefly go over the most common kinds of studies that somebody might see and talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of each one?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So it can be really overwhelming when you know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of journals that you can choose from. But I think a very simple approach is first to know what types of studies there are. And there are several types that may suit what you're trying to focus your research on. So for instance, observational studies, those include cohort studies, case control studies, and cross-sectional studies. And I'll kind of go into a definition of three of these because they can get a little bit confusing. So cohort studies are when you follow a group of people. So you're looking at very specific time points and you're following them over a period of time. So for instance, our research team may recruit people, who don't have cancer and collect information about them for years. And sometimes we actually have studies where we have breast cancer patients and we follow them over a period of time as well. Then we look at whether or not they develop certain conditions. So for instance, if it was a study where they were otherwise healthy individuals, we might look at them over time to see if in this specific group they develop, let's say, breast cancer. So cohort studies are very useful ways of finding out more information about risk factors. But unfortunately, they're really expensive. They're kind of time consuming. They can be used when it wouldn't be possible to test a theory really any other way. Okay. There are studies that are also called case control studies, and they actually kind of work in the opposite way of cohort studies. So in these particular studies, the research team recruits a group of people who have a disease, so we call these cases, and we recruit a group of people who don't have a disease, and they are called the controls. And then we look back to see how many people in each group were exposed to a certain risk factor. And as researchers, we want to make the results as reliable as possible. So we try to make sure the people in each group have the same general factors. So that might be a similar age, gender, and so forth. So case control studies are actually pretty useful. They're definitely a lot quicker and cheaper than cohort studies. But one of the issues is that it can be a little bit less reliable. The research team will often rely on people thinking back and remembering what they were exposed to as a risk factor or not. And as you know, memory can kind of serve us wrong. So that is one of the limitations of this type of study.
I've seen a lot here. I don't mean to interrupt, but we're looking at what people eat. And is that a risk factor, like how much fat or this or that? And I always tell people you have to take those with a grain of salt, because if somebody asks you, how much milk did you drink when you were 6 years old? My guess is that you may not be as accurate as you might be. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
Yes, Jamie, that's a really great point. So a lot of my research focuses on lifestyle and nutrition as well as exercise. And a lot of that is actually recall. We do these nutrition recall surveys, and sometimes it really is hard for people to remember, or even, how much exercise did you do over X period of time or when you did it. So I think you just highlight that point. So I would highlight that actually another difference with this is you can't just assume association with causality. And so that's one of the limitations of this type of study as well. So just because there's an association between some particular factor and a disease, let's say breast cancer, it doesn't mean that that factor actually causes the disease. And lastly, the cross-sectional studies, those are basically carried out at one point in time or over a very short period of time. So they find out, who's been exposed to a specific risk factor and who's developed, let's say, breast cancer. And then we try to see if there's a link. So the benefit of doing cross-sectional studies is that they're really quick, they're super cheap, but once again, the results may not be as useful as you want them to be. So sometimes as researchers, we do a cross-sectional study first to just find if there's any possible link. And then we go on and we do a case control or a cohort study to look at that specific issue in a lot more detail. So now I'm going to move on because there's actually other types of studies like pilot studies and feasibility studies. So that's why I said, kind of have an idea of what you're trying to focus in on, because there's a wealth of information out there. So feasibility studies, they're basically designed to see if it's even possible to do the main study. So the aim is to find out whether or not patients and doctors are happy to take part in the study, how long it might take to collect and analyze the information. And they don't actually answer, the main research question about, like, for instance, how well a treatment works, but just, is this feasible? Can we do this? And next, we have pilot studies. And these are essentially small scale versions of the main study. So a pilot study helps to test that all the main parts of the study work together. So they may also help to answer the research question. Sometimes the research team includes the information collected during the pilot study in the results in the main study. So those are kind of the studies that precede some of the bigger studies that you might have heard about or read about. Then there are other studies called prevention studies and screening trials and treatment trials. So it really depends on, which aspect of care you're looking at. So some people are really interested in breast cancer prevention studies. Some people want to know about, breast cancer screening studies. And some people are looking for therapeutic clinical trials or treatment trials. So, it's important to highlight that prevention trials look at whether a particular treatment can help prevent, let's say, breast cancer. So the people taking part don't have cancer. And these trials really are kind of for the general population of people who either have, higher than normal risk of developing a certain cancer. So this could be people, for instance, who have like a family history or any other risk factor that would increase their risk of having, let's say, breast cancer. And then we have screening trials. So screening means that you're testing people for the early signs of cancer before they have any symptoms. So similar to prevention trials, screening trials are often for the general population, or they can be for a group of people who have a higher than normal risk of developing a breast cancer. Perhaps they had a strong family history or something else that confers a higher risk. A lot of researchers may plan screening trials to see if a new test is reliable enough to detect particular types of cancer, or they may try to find out if there's an overall benefit in picking up a cancer early. I would say that a lot of the trials that people are interested in learning about when they've had a breast cancer diagnosis are treatment trials.
I was going to say, yeah, I think most of our audience, not all, but more than half of our audience are people who've been diagnosed. And I believe that's what they're really interested in. Like, what are the new treatments? This treatment stopped working for me. How do I find out about new ones?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's interesting because sometimes people are interested because they want to help educate, their family members, or oftentimes patients come in with a family member who's really interested in learning about kind of all different aspects of this, but kind of focusing in on what you're talking about, which is the clinical trials. these are research studies that are performed in people that are aimed at evaluating either a medical, surgical, or behavioral intervention. And they are really the primary way that as researchers, we find out if a new treatment, like a new drug or a diet or a medical device, is safe and effective in this group. So often a clinical trial is used to learn if there's efficacy and or if there's really harmful side effects of a new treatment.
Okay. And when you say efficacy, I just want to make sure everybody understands that that's how efficient it is. Does it work, right?
Exactly. And, I'll get down to this probably a little bit later when you ask me about it, but there's a lot of different kind of intents or goals of clinical trials. And what you want to know is also what the primary endpoint is. Like, what is it that they care about? Okay. Are they looking at survival? Are they looking at progression-free survival? Are they looking at quality of life? It's very variable between all the studies because all of these things do matter to us.
Okay. Now, did you have more? Before I
always have more to talk about, Jamie. You know that. I actually just want to briefly touch upon clinical trials.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of language that's in it that people might read about or hear about. So, the first thing is that you'll hear about randomization in a clinical trial. Mm-hmm. And that is a very important aspect of it. You heard about it in the video and why these are the studies that we are really excited about because in the process of doing that, we're assigning patients just by chance to groups that receive different treatments. And, in the simplest design, it's either you're getting a new treatment versus the standard of care. And so you're really having a direct comparison in real time. And you'll also hear about blinding in a clinical trial. And that refers to basically like hiding the group, which group someone is allocated to. And we have single blind studies where the patients don't know which group they're in. And we even have double blind studies. That's where the patient and the researchers and doctors don't know which group the patient in. It's a very select number of people on the research team that actually know what people are getting. And I will say, just like the video, the gold standard for testing interventions in people is the randomized, placebo-controlled clinical trial. And that means that volunteers are randomly assigned really by chance, flip of a coin, to either a test group receiving this experimental intervention or essentially a control group that's receiving the placebo or the equivalent standard of care.
Excellent. That's a lot to take in, but I do want to let everybody know, in case you're wondering, you will get an email with a link to a recording of this webinar. So if you need to go back and sort of listen to that again, you can definitely do that. Now, if there's somebody like me, not a scientist, not a physician, and I want to read about breast cancer research, how would you recommend I start? I know, as we saw in the video, a lot of the abstracts are available online for free. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a good place to start?
Everyone's in a different situation. I think everyone's health literacy is quite variable. And what I would do is, explore. So I always think that if you are if you're on the patient side, perhaps reading some patient-focused information is ideal, because oftentimes we want you to use websites that have been vetted by physicians. So for instance, I think of Breastcancer.org, I think of Cancer.net, which gets information from ASCO, which is our societal organization. I think of Komen. So those are kind of the big websites that I would initially go to for information. And the reason why I like these websites is because there are patient education materials, there are fact sheets, there are a wide range of topics that are being covered on survivorship, care planning, COVID-19, palliative care. I've looked through essentially all of these websites, and I do think the quality and the quantity of the material presented is excellent. They do have a different presentation style. So sometimes you read, a certain article on a page and you think, oh, actually, I think I really understood it better when it was explained through this organization. But I think that's a good place to start. Now, if you're at the point where you're saying, okay, well, I did that and I got some basic information, but I want to learn more. And in those cases, I would say, it is certainly accessible for you to go to, for instance, any of the journals that we read as scientists. And some of those, for instance, are like the Journal of Clinical Oncology, the New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, Cancer, JAMA Oncology. Of course, those are going to be challenging to read. Sometimes I find those challenging to read as well.
Yeah.
So those are an option. And then also, we do have these annual conferences for oncology, and some of them are breast focused, such as the one in San Antonio, which is in December. So we do get some kind of exciting information oftentimes at these, and those will be published on the formal websites as well. So that's actually kind of what I would recommend is first kind of do your research in these different patient-facing websites, then consider some of the larger societal organizations that release abstracts and publications, and then the actual larger journals that publish a vast amount of information.
Okay. And you mentioned several of the journals there. Could you talk a little bit about how important it is to consider the journal that the information's published in? Because that can be sensory overload as well. There are so many scientific journals out there now. And how do you tell which one is really good and which one is maybe a little bit fly by the seat of its pants?
Yeah. So Jamie, I'm so happy you asked that question, because it is one of the most frequent questions I get, because when you know that there are hundreds of thousands of journals, selecting one can be challenging. So I will say that very objectively that we do look at the publication power of each journal. That's what we do as scientists. We're basically looking at the ranking position of each journal based on the actual publishing behavior of leading tenured academics over an extended period of time. And so the journal's ranking position reflects the frequency at which these particular scholars are publishing articles in a journal. The metric that you'll actually hear a lot more often or see is actually a journal's impact factor, or what we call an IF.
Yeah.
And that's actually based on how often articles published in that journal during the previous 2 years were cited by articles published in a particular year. So as you can imagine, the higher a journal's impact factor, the more frequently articles in that journal are being cited by other articles. So that's a more scientific metric. I will say that I think that there are numerous journals that have high and low impact factors that I read through, that I think have good quality work. It's sometimes just familiarizing yourself with what their mission and what their content is.
Okay, that's helpful. Now, could you take us through the basic sections of an abstract of a research article? Because, they are free online. I get the feeling that some people go there and maybe they get a little bit frustrated because, it can be very dense. So if you could just sort of briefly talk about each section and maybe and give us a summary of what you might find in each section. And also, sure. I should say too, I don't mean to interrupt, but sometimes each journal has a different name for the sections. I mean, I know the information in each can be kind of standard, but they may have a slightly different name for each section.
Sure, Jamie. And I do see that you've shared a slide with everyone to view as well.
Yes, make it a little more helpful.
So you can tell here. So there's a few things that I look for in an abstract. So first, look at the title, read the title. Next, look at what the purpose of this study was. So for instance, the title of this is the development and validation of a risk tool for predicting severe toxicity in older adults receiving chemo for early stage breast cancer. So the purpose of it is limited tools exist to predict the risk of chemotoxicity in older adults with early stage breast cancer. So I think that gives you an idea of what the topic is. And then from there, some of the abstracts actually have an introduction. In the Journal of Clinical Oncology, you don't necessarily see that. The subsequent section is a method section. So you'll see here, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but essentially that's telling you how this research is being done. So what are the experiments? It can sometimes be really difficult to read because of technical language and details, but you can generally get a gist of the target population. After the methods section is the results section. And this is basically where all the key data is presented. Sometimes there are figures and tables within the publication itself. And really, this is where the data is being presented to support a conclusion. So usually at the very bottom, the authors are basically going to tell you this is the take-home point. And some of the journals, instead of calling it conclusion, they sometimes call it a discussion too, because that's where they want to elaborate on, the answer that was proposed. They want to explain how the results can support the conclusion. So, those are the basic, components of going through an abstract. I will tell you that when you're looking through numerous abstracts and you're just trying to figure out which ones you want to read, I would actually recommend, number one, looking at the title, looking at the purpose, and then if you want, just really quick, jumping to the conclusion and seeing what the take-home message is. And if that's exciting to you, then go back, then look at the methods, then look at the results, read the discussion. But it's a really good way to filter out content to make sure it's what you want to read about, that it's applicable to you.
Okay. I will admit too, when I'm reading journal articles and trying to figure out which ones are going to go in our research news stories, I usually read the conclusion first because I want to know if they found out, like sometimes if it didn't work, they'll say, we found out that this new drug wasn't any more effective than the standard of care. So I'm like, okay, so that's not really worth writing about because it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Jamie, which is sometimes, you get the take home point. You don't need to read the whole article or abstract to even know, okay, well, that was not, perhaps they're looking at a treatment being inferior, superior to whatever it is the other comparison is. So that's a great point. Save yourself some time.
Exactly. So if I've been diagnosed with breast cancer and I'm looking at some abstracts, which part of the abstract is going to help me figure out if that research really applies to my situation and the type of cancer I've been diagnosed with?
Right, sure. So I would say probably the best section to get that information from is going to be the methods section. So here, thank you for scrolling down and highlighting the methods section here. So essentially, each study has a protocol, and these guidelines say who can and cannot participate in a study. So these are actually called, quote unquote, eligibility criteria, and they describe the characteristics that must be shared by all of the participants. Now, of course, as you mentioned, the criteria can differ from one study to another study. And so this is the key information that you want to be able to extract. So they can include age, gender, medical history, specifics about the breast cancer, sometimes some other health status components. So here you'll see in the methods section, if we just quickly read through it, it says patients of age at least 65 and older with stage 1 through 3 breast cancer from 16 different institutions treated with neoadjuvant or adjuvant chemotherapy or prospectively evaluated for geriatric and clinical features predictive of grade 3 through 5 chemotherapy toxicity. So in essence, yes, it's a mouthful. But, the takeaway home message from this is age 65 and older, early stage breast cancer, stage 1, 2, and 3, and had to have been treated with some sort of chemotherapy, whether it was before surgery or after surgery. So in essence, that is what we also call, quote unquote, inclusion criteria. So that is basically how we decide who to include in the study. So the purpose of that is to make sure that the study population is consistent, it's reliable, it's uniform, and it's objective. And there are, in many studies, there are also exclusion criteria, and those include the factors and characteristics that make the recruited population ineligible for the study. We don't always include that in the abstract because it's very wordy and lengthy, and we don't have very much space in the abstract. But if you read the actual journal article itself, oftentimes we will include these were the inclusion criteria, these were the exclusion criteria. And sometimes it's important to know those things because we acknowledge that some of these factors can be confounders for the outcome variable that's being looked at. Okay. And so when we really focus on it, we know that the proper selection of the inclusion criteria really help to optimize the validity of a study. So So it usually makes it more feasible. It lowers the cost. It can minimize some of the ethical concerns. So, I think the take-home message is good selection criteria ensures that it's a more homogeneous sample population to reduce that quote-unquote confounding. So the confounding is basically when there's another factor that may actually interfere with the outcome.
Okay. And looking at this particular abstract, for example, so if I'm younger than 65, I know this study doesn't apply to me. So
correct. Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Certainly. So that's a good deduction, Jamie.
Okay. And then, there's some technical language in here, neoadjuvant, adjuvant. That's not something that the average person necessarily talks about unless they have been diagnosed with cancer. So are there other scientific terms or some of the scientific jargon that you would say the terms are helpful for people to understand when they're reading a paper?
Yes, certainly. So there are numerous ones. I can just touch upon, you saw in the abstract when the results section was noted that they noted p-values, and also in the video that was shown at the very beginning, there was also a discussion of p-values. So it's important when you're reading an abstract to know, what is the purpose of this? And what do the authors think is going to happen from this study? Because that is the hypothesis. And so when you're actually trying to determine whether or not something is going to be significant from the study, we actually create something called what we call a null hypothesis. So we assume that there's actually no relationship. So we say there's no relationship between, let's say, A and B, or A does not predict B. So, you may notice a correlation, but you really have to use the p-value to determine, is it statistically significant? So the p-value essentially adjusts for uncertainty by telling you how likely is the effect observed in your data if, let's say, that original hypothesis were true. So, very simply, I always just view the p-value as the probability that a difference between those two things is going to be equal to or more than something that is more extreme than what you're actually seeing. So I think the easiest thing to do is probably to at least get an example of this, because otherwise it's just a lot of jargon. So for instance, if you say that we're establishing a statistically significant level of 0.05, which is very common, then a p-value less than 0.05 tells you that, assuming that null hypothesis is true, a very small probability of obtaining a result that's equal to or more extreme is observed. So for example, that means 1 in 20 people, or a 5% probability. So then you're actually able to reject that original null hypothesis. On the other hand, if you were to, let's say you set the p-value very high at, less than 0.65, then you're assuming that the null hypothesis is true, you would expect to obtain the observed result or something more extreme 65% of the time. So that's why we really want to keep it tight, and we like that p-value less than 0.05.
Okay. Yeah, p-value. I never had statistics because I was a journalism major, not a science major. But what I've always been told, the simplest way to understand it is smaller is better. So if you have a study and the p-value is really small, that means that result is good. Like if it's looking at a new medicine compared to the standard of care, and the difference is a very small p-value, then that new medicine is probably pretty good.
Yeah, Jamie, I think that's a good point. And I actually want to expand on that just a little bit more. So in the abstract that we just saw, you didn't just see a p-value, you actually saw a CI, which stands for a confidence interval as well.
Sure.
And, I don't want to say the p-value is not important, but the p-value by itself does not mean as much as you think it means.
Okay.
So it has to be put in context. So p-value has to be put in context. And the way you do that is you find out what the confidence interval is. So for instance, a p-value does not measure the size of an effect or the importance of the results. So, for instance, the p-value does not measure the probability that the studied hypothesis is true or the probability that the data were produced by random chance alone. So the reason why you want to look at a confidence interval is it displays the probability that a parameter is going to fall between a pair of values right around a mean. So, the confidence interval shows you a range in which the true measure lies. So usually the confidence interval is set at 95%, which tells you that if you did this study 100 times, 95 out of 100 times, the true measure lies between those two numbers. That's why it's so important to don't just look at the p-value. I think it's important, but you have to look at it in the context of a confidence interval.
Okay.
And so essentially, the width of the confidence interval and the size of the p-value are related to each other. So the narrower the confidence interval, the smaller the p-value. Sometimes you get a statistically significant p-value, but then you look at the confidence interval and it's huge. And so that kind of, you have to think about that a little bit because it's showing you about the magnitude of the effect.
Okay. Now, are there other terms you want to talk about, or?
If we have a little bit of time, I could talk about a few more.
Maybe one more, because I have a couple more questions. So, and I know it's a little bit, it's like 4:45. So,
yes. So, how about hazard ratio? Because I think that does come up quite a bit in the literature if you're reading some of the articles. So, essentially, I mentioned to you before, but a lot of times the outcome measure that people are really interested in the study is survival. Mm-hmm. They want to know, if I take this treatment compared to this treatment, is there going to be a benefit in survival? And so we use the hazard ratio because it's the ratio of the hazard rates corresponding to conditions described by two levels of a variable. So let me just give you an example, because examples are always easier to understand. Definitely. So in a drug study, the treated population could die at twice the rate per unit time of the control population. So as for kind of all the other measures, a hazard ratio of 1 means that there's no association, period. If there's a hazard ratio greater than 1, it means increased risk, right? So that means more people are dying. Mm-hmm. A hazard ratio below 1 suggests a smaller risk. So that's kind of it's just important to be able to know what that means, because you'll see it if you're looking at survival data. And very quickly, you'll also see a Kaplan-Meier curve often in these types of survival studies, especially, Jamie, you told me that the audience listening to this might be patients who are looking at clinical trials or therapeutics. A Kaplan-Meier curve is basically a that's going to show you the probability of an event such as survival at a certain time interval. And if the sample size or the number of people in the study is large enough, that curve should approach the true survival function for the population that's under investigation. Okay.
And just to go back to confidence interval, clarify for my own personal information, if the confidence interval is higher than 1 and it's related to, say, a new treatment, that means that the new treatment isn't actually working as well as it was thought it was going to. Whereas the confidence interval is below 1, that means that the people that got the new treatment are doing better than the people that didn't. Am I understanding that correctly?
Generally, yes. But what I would comment on is that it's going to depend on what you're specifically looking at. So what I will tell you is that when you look at a confidence interval, if that range includes 1, that means it wasn't statistically significant. Okay. And it's highly unlikely that you'll have a significant p-value along with that. But for instance, if you're looking at the confidence interval and let's say it's greater than greater than 1, that means that, let's say it's between 1.5 to 2. So then you can associate that there's a higher, that you can assume with greater confidence that that number is going to fall within that range.
Okay. I think I understand that, but but as you said, you have to know what the goal is of the study to interpret all that correctly. So
yes, you do. And I think the easiest thing to do is it can be challenging to learn all of this on your own.
Yeah.
So, interpreting it in an appropriate setting. Like, I think all the virtual webinars that people have, the videos, that's how you learn. Trying to teach yourself statistics is really challenging.
Yeah, I bet. Well, so I know there's a lot of popular media coverage of cancer research, and a lot of it can make it sound like there's going to be a cure within 6 months. And then if you actually get into it and read the study, it's like, oh, well, this was done on cells and petri dishes. And to me, because I've had the privilege to talk to so many researchers, I know that means that particular medicine could be 7 to 10 years down the road, if it even makes it that far. So could you talk a little bit about, when we're reading stories in the popular media, how do we figure out if it's just hype, if there's really something there? What's the best way to go about that?
So that's a really good question. I think that probably you need a sounding board whenever you hear about any of this type of research. Like I said, if it's just an abstract, just one paper, and you don't have kind of this reference point or people to discuss it with, you might kind of be misled about the direction that a study is going in. Even when we get really exciting data, we've been waiting 5 years for a study to really share the results. We all talk about it with one another. And so I think that's the best thing to do. Sometimes I have patients who've been reading about studies, and I would say, well, share that study with me. I want to know what you're reading, or I want to help you interpret that information, because it really is helpful when you look at it the lens through perhaps, a scientist, your doctor, or someone else. And also thinking about your peer group, essentially. There are a lot of support groups that are led by advocates, navigators, people who've really invested a lot of time into learning how to read these things, and they can help guide you. And that's one of the neat things that I think GRASP is able to offer, is that we have individuals who are physicians and scientists, and we also have a lot of advocates that have a lot of information and have devoted quite a bit of time to learning how to be analytical about this stuff. I would highlight that, you mentioned things that are being done in petri dishes and in the lab and in mice, and then early phase studies. And I just always tell people, read that information because it's exciting, but that is all experimental, and we don't have robust data that should be done in clinical practice. And that's why we take these studies to clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and even phase 4 studies. So, in the lab, we can find something really neat and exciting, but we might want to test that in a phase 1 study. And so, I think that knowing what the definitions of those are really important. So for instance, a phase 1 study is testing an experimental drug or treatment in a very small group of people for the first time. So, we're looking at safety, we're looking at the right dosage, we're looking at side effects. That's actually not to test for effectiveness, versus a phase 2 study means that, an experimental drug or treatment, it was tested in a phase 1 study. We know what dose to give it at. We know what the side effects might be. But now let's give it to a larger number of people to actually see how effective it is, and also to further evaluate its safety. And then the big studies are like the phase 3 studies. And these are experimental studies where the drug or the treatment is given to a very large number of people. And we are trying to confirm its effectiveness. We're still looking at side effects, and we're trying to compare it to a commonly used treatment. So that could be the quote unquote standard of care. Sometimes it's a placebo, because sometimes the standard of care is not having a treatment being recommended in a particular setting. And lastly, we have these phase 4 studies that you don't hear too much about, because by then, these are post-marketing studies, which means that after they're approved by the FDA, they're continuing to do it to collect information about risks and benefit, et cetera. So I would just say, make sure you know what type of study you're looking at.
Okay. And do you think it makes sense if I'm a patient, somebody who's been diagnosed with breast cancer, should I stick to the phase 3 studies? I mean, obviously, you said the phase 1 and the phase 2, they can be exciting and they kind of give you a hint of what's coming. But if I really want to know like new stuff that's out there for me, I should probably stick to the phase 3. Do you think?
I generally do agree with that statement. So if you're looking for what can actually be used at a clinical level, you have to use the data that's being tested in larger populations. I will tell you that your oncologist is certainly abiding by the standard of care. And whenever we deviate from the standard of care, I would recommend doing that in a clinical trial. Of course, there are certain situations where we have sometimes done something off-label where it's not indicated, it's not approved in that setting. We don't necessarily have the robust data, but it is sometimes a unique situation. I'll tell you that being at Hopkins, at being a very large academic center, we have quite a few trials that we're able to offer patients. And whenever we do deviate from the standard of care, we do prefer to be studying it on a clinical trial when possible. So I would agree with you, Jamie, that if you're looking at data, even a phase 3, sometimes that is often data that is not, it's pushing and allowing us to approve something as a new standard of care, but it's usually not the standard of care yet. But sometimes it could help guide some decision-making for an oncologist. I think every situation is so unique. So I always tell patients, if there's anything you're really concerned about and you want to talk about in terms of therapeutics, talk to your medical oncologist about it. Have that transparency in your relationship and feel comfortable enough that you can have that discussion.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. I'm going to pull one from the audience.
Sure.
Somebody asked, what does it mean for a study to be peer-reviewed? And how does that work? And why is it important?
Great. That's a really good question. So peer review is very important. Those journals that I referenced before that have those kind of higher impact factors, they are all peer reviewed. And what that means is that body of work is being evaluated by one or more people with similar expertise and competency as the producers of the work. So it really functions as a form of kind of self-regulation by very qualified members of that field. And so these articles are usually all written by experts, or they are reviewed by several experts in the field before they can even be published. And that's really to just ensure article quality. So I do highly recommend, if you're going to read the journal articles, please try to read the ones that, have more credibility, have an impact factor, are peer reviewed.
And in most cases, I know because I look for this myself, you can find out if a journal is peer reviewed. If you're online, if you just look about the journal, it'll tell you, this is peer reviewed. It often may give, the editorial board, all those kinds of things, and you can see who's doing that work.
Absolutely. Yep. So they have to be very transparent about that information and what that process is. So all of that information is really at your fingertips.
Excellent. Dr. Sheng, thank you so much for sharing all this helpful information with us today. It's been so great. I do also want to thank everybody out there for attending. We really appreciate you joining us. Next week, as I said, you're going to be getting an email with a link to a recording of today's program. And I do apologize, we did not get to a whole lot of questions from the audience. But if you tune into our Instagram Live next Wednesday, February 24th at 12:30 p.m., Dr. Weiss is going to compile these questions and answer as many as she can that we did not get to on today's webinar. So our Instagram handle is at Breastcancer.org. There's no dot in it. It's Breastcancer.org. Now, if you're interested in staying on top of breast cancer research developments, you can go to breastcancer.org/research-news, where you'll find our coverage of breast cancer research from around the world. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletters about research news by going to breastcancer.org. Look for the Stay Informed headline in the blue panel on the right side of the homepage. It's helpfully highlighted here on the slide. And if just below that is a link you can click to sign up. And thank you again to everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here.